There is a place on the Keweenaw Peninsula in northern Michigan where the bedrock breaks open and pure copper lies exposed at the surface. Not ore, not mineral deposits embedded in matrix rock. Copper metal, native and refined looking, sitting in seams and masses, as if it had been placed there rather than formed there. Some of the largest single pieces ever recovered weighed over 500 tons, and the pits surrounding those deposits are old, very old, older than any European presence in North America, older, according to some estimates, than any civilization the established record is willing to acknowledge. The official story is tidy. Pre-Columbian indigenous peoples mined copper from the Lake Superior Basin over thousands of years using stone hammers and antler tools. They traded it across the continent through what archaeologists call the Old Copper Complex. The copper enriched ceremonial life and funerary practice. Then, around 3,000 years ago, the mining stopped for reasons no one has convincingly explained, and the pits sat dormant until European explorers rediscovered them in the 17th century. That is the story in the textbooks. But there is another story. It was not written down because the people who held it made a deliberate choice not to write it down. The Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe people who had inhabited the Lake Superior region for generations before European contact, had a body of knowledge about those mines that their elders carried in silence for centuries. Not because they had forgotten, because they remembered too well. In 1907, an ethnographer named William Warren, himself of mixed Ojibwe and European ancestry, had already been dead for decades. But the accounts he had gathered during his lifetime, combined with testimony collected in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by researchers working among the Ojibwe communities of the Great Lakes, began to surface in a way that created a problem for academic archaeology. The elders who finally spoke were not speaking carelessly. They were old men who had carried these accounts from older men in an unbroken chain, describing the copper places with a specificity and a gravity that did not fit the sanitized academic framing. What they described was not a primitive mining operation. The Ojibwe oral tradition around the copper sites contained consistent elements that the researchers of that era were not equipped to process honestly. The mines, elders said, had been worked by people who were not their ancestors, people who came before, people who left when something happened that the Ojibwe language encoded not as departure, but as removal. The distinction matters. Departure implies choice. Removal implies, and I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Something older. This sits uncomfortably alongside the physical evidence. Archaeological surveys conducted at the Keweenaw and Isle Royale sites in the 19th and 20th centuries produced numbers that have never been satisfactorily explained. Conservative estimates of copper removed from the Lake Superior Basin in pre-Columbian times run to 500,000 tons. Some estimates reach significantly higher. The quantity of stone hammers recovered from the mine pits, over 10 million by some counts, suggests an industrial operation running at a scale that the old copper complex model does not plausibly account for. The old copper complex, as archaeologists define it, flourished between roughly 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. That is a 2,000-year operational window. If 500,000 tons of copper were extracted across that period using the stone tool technology the academic model proposes, the labour involved staggers the imagination. It implies a permanent, organised, large-scale workforce operating in coordinated fashion across dozens of sites simultaneously, with a logistics infrastructure capable of feeding, housing and directing that workforce in some of the most geographically challenging terrain in eastern North America. No evidence of such an infrastructure has been found. No settlement patterns consistent with that population density have been identified in the region. No food storage or agricultural traces, no structures, no refuse accumulations proportional to the scale of the operation. What has been found is copper removal evidence and stone tools and almost nothing else. The people who did this work arrived, worked and left no domestic trace, or the domestic trace has been explained away, or it lies beneath the lake. The cessation event is the detail that academic archaeology handles most poorly. Around 3,000 years ago, the mining stopped. This is established in the sediment record in the tool deposits in the site's stratigraphy. It stopped completely and apparently simultaneously across multiple sites. Not a gradual wind down, not a regional contraction followed by consolidation elsewhere, a cessation. The industry that had run across a 2,000-year window. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The ones who worked the copper were taken, not killed, not dispersed, taken. The distinction was consistent across accounts gathered from communities with limited contact with each other. The word used in various forms across Ojibwe dialects encoded a movement that was not voluntary and not local. The copper people went somewhere that was not accessible by foot or canoe. Researchers of that period wrote these accounts down and then filed them as mythology. This is the pattern that appears again and again across the revisionist historical record. An indigenous oral tradition carries specific, consistent, genealogically grounded testimony about events that do not fit the academic model. The testimony is collected, documented, sometimes published, and then reclassified. Mythology, legend, metaphor. The reclassification is not argued, it is assumed. The assumption is that pre-literate peoples encode historical memory in narrative form, and that the narrative form introduces distortion that makes the content historically unreliable. But that assumption has a problem. The Ojibwe oral tradition on other subjects has proven remarkably accurate when tested against physical evidence. Account after account of shoreline features, island geography, and water movement patterns preserved in Ojibwe oral history have been confirmed by geological and hydrological surveys. The memory tradition was not decorative, it was functional. It was a technology for storing and transmitting accurate information across generations without writing. When that same tradition says the copper workers were not their ancestors, and that those workers were removed rather than departed, the standard academic move is to treat this as the one case where the tradition failed, where it slipped into myth, where the reliable memory-keeping apparatus suddenly produced unreliable output. That is a convenient distinction to make. It is not an argued one. The 1907 threshold is worth dwelling on. The late 19th and early 20th centuries represent the last period in which elders with deep lineage connection to the pre-reservation oral tradition were still alive and still speaking. The men who gave testimony in that window were typically in their 70s and 80s, carrying knowledge received from elders born before the treaty era reshaped Great Lakes political geography. After 1907, after the generation that spoke to early ethnographers was gone, the knowledge transmission that had persisted for millennia entered crisis. The reservation system, the boarding school system, the systematic suppression of indigenous languages and ceremonial practice. These did not merely disrupt cultural continuity, they severed it in ways that cannot be fully repaired or reconstructed. What the elders said in 1907 may be the last clear transmission of what the Anishinaabe peoples knew about those copper mines. And what they said was that the mines were old before their people arrived, that the miners were not them, and that what happened to those miners was something the Ojibwe language could describe, but the English language of 1907 had no category for. The Tartarian framework offers a different way to hold these accounts. If the Lake Superior copper mines were not a pre-Columbian indigenous operation, but rather a remnant of a prior technological civilization, then the anomalies fall into alignment. The scale of extraction is no longer mysterious because it was not accomplished with stone hammers over 2 millennia. The absence of domestic infrastructure is no longer a puzzle because the infrastructure belonged to a civilization that has been systematically removed from the record, not merely from the ground. The cessation event is not a market fluctuation or a climate shift or a population collapse. It is the end of the civilization that built the operation. And the Ojibwe oral tradition is not mythology. It is eyewitness adjacent memory, transmitted across generations, describing the end of something that preceded the world the Ojibwe themselves inherited. The copper itself provides a layer of physical evidence that sits uneasily in the mainstream framing. Native copper of the quality found in the Lake Superior Basin, nearly pure, requiring no smelting, extractable in massive single masses, does not exist in comparable deposits anywhere else on Earth at comparable scale. The ancient world's known copper supply was smelted from ore. The Lake Superior copper required no such processing. It was ready to use as extracted. The distribution of Lake Superior copper in the archaeological record extends far beyond any plausible trade network for a stone tool culture. Copper artifacts clearly originating from the Keweenaw and Isle Royale sites have been identified in locations along the Gulf of Mexico, in the Ohio Valley, in the Appalachian Highlands, and in locations that would require either a sophisticated long-distance trade infrastructure or a civilization with the logistical capacity to move material across a continent. The old copper complex model attributes this distribution to trade. But trade in what direction, by whom, and through what structures, the model cannot answer. The 1907 testimonies described the copper people as builders, not in the generic sense that any culture builds, but in a specific sense. They built with permanence as an intention. What they built, the elders said, was meant to last beyond their own time, meant to be found. This detail, which the researchers who recorded it treated as poetic elaboration, appears in multiple independent accounts. The people who worked the copper were building something that was not for themselves alone. If you take that testimony at face value, a different question emerges. Not where did the copper go, but what was the copper for? The volume of copper removed from the Lake Superior Basin has no accounting on the receiving end. Copper artifacts recovered from North American archaeological sites account for a fraction of what was removed. The majority of the copper that came out of those mines in the pre-Columbian period has not been located. It was not hoarded in known sites. It was not buried in recoverable caches. 500,000 tons of nearly pure copper metal left the Lake Superior Basin and went somewhere that archaeology has not found. The official explanation is that most of it corroded, that it was used and lost and decomposed over 3,000 years into untraceable oxide. This is possible for small copper objects in acidic soils. It is not a convincing explanation for the large masses, for the structural grade material, for the copper that showed signs of working in ways that Stone Age tools cannot produce. The Ojibwe elders who finally spoke in and around 1907 were not confused people reciting garbled myth. They were the last clear link to a knowledge tradition that had carried, with the precision that oral traditions can carry, a memory of something that happened at the place where the copper was. They named what they knew. They named the ones who came before as distinct from themselves. They named the removal as deliberate and external. And then, within a generation, the chain of transmission broke, and the knowledge entered the kind of silence that is not chosen, but imposed. What the elders refused to say for centuries before 1907 was not a secret kept out of embarrassment or fear of disbelief. It was a responsibility held until there was a listener willing to receive it without immediately reducing it to metaphor. Whether those listeners in 1907 were worthy of what they received is a question the archive cannot answer. What the archive does preserve is the testimony itself, and the testimony does not fit the official story of the Lake Superior copper mines in ways that deserve more than the silence that has been applied to them for the past century. The pits are still there, the copper is still entirely gone. The questions have not gotten any smaller with time, and the long silence above them has not grown lighter.